We interact with TVs, computers, and video games multiple times a day, every day.
Most of the time, we don't even consider why we control them or interact with them the way that we do.
This week, we'll be talking about the outliers.
I'm Grayson.
I'm Ezra.
And this is Are We Doing This Right? On WEGL 91.1 Auburn.
Okay, so to get us started, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of input devices, traditionally the input devices with computers. So your standard keyboard computer, it's a QWERTY keyboard layout. And if you look down at a keyboard, that's because it's named after the keys across the top, Q, W, E, R, T, and Y. So you might be, I think you already know this, Grayson, but do you know why keyboards are in like QWERTY, like why that exists, why that's the order, not like A, B, C, D or something else?
The most common story I've heard is it was kind of an artifact from typewriters being mechanical devices, and they would get tangled up if you put the most common letters too close together.
Exactly. As people got more proficient with like the original typewriters, they'd start typing faster. And if you pressed two letters that were too close together too quickly, then it would jam, especially on cheap typewriters. Apparently, it was originally kind of like a price-saving thing. You could make the form more compact or use less metal if you put the pieces closer together, but a byproduct of doing that was they had to be QWERTY. That had to be the format. So there's been a lot of debate of QWERTY versus Dvorak, and Dvorak is this other method of inputting stuff on a keyboard. It's basically just an alternative keyboard layout. And I actually always thought Dvorak was named the same way QWERTY was because it would start with D-V-A-R-H-O-K. I didn't think about it too hard. I had never used a Dvorak keyboard, but it's actually named after this guy called August Dvorak. I don't know if you knew that.
Are we talking about another Russian person for the third week in a row?
Actually, August Dvorak was American, or at least he lived in America.
Dang it.
I know, so close. But he developed this. He thought the old system was not necessary for modern keyboards. I think he was actually using typewriters when he was testing it. But he was using, I guess, like his typewriters were designed to not get jammed. Basically, they were the rods were thinner. He didn't have the same restrictions as a QWERTY keyboard. And so the United States Navy actually kind of put this idea up to the test. And so he oversaw a study to compare Dvorak keyboards versus QWERTY keyboards and compare efficiency, given enough time to train the people. So they took people who were already proficient at QWERTY, and he spent about 100 hours drilling them in Dvorak. And in the end result, according to him, was exponentially faster. Of course, this is like recently, there's been a lot of controversy because people have, I say recently, I mean like past 20 years, people discovered that these original studies, because August Dvorak oversaw them, he skewed the results. Basically, the claims range from they were outright fabricated to they were just heavily exaggerated. According to him, the average person typing on a QWERTY keyboard moves their hand roughly 20 miles in a full day of typing, whereas with a Dvorak keyboard, they moved their hand only 1 mile.
How exaggerated was that? Do you know?
There haven't been a whole lot of recent studies to confirm it, so I couldn't have an exact number to compare it to. But if you compare like words per minute of Dvorak users, at best, you're looking at about 90 WPM versus about 80 on your average person trained to use Dvorak. And of course, 10 words per minute seems like a lot, but when you consider that it takes a few hundred hours to even reach that level, you can kind of ultimately conclude that the time that you save learning Dvorak would have been better spent not learning Dvorak.
Right, after you've been spending your entire life typing on QWERTY, just breaking those kinds of associations in your mind, like most people using a keyboard, if they've been using one for any length of time, don't even think about like where the letters are, and having to retrain yourself for that would be a monumental task in and of itself.
Oh, it sounds so frustrating. And there have been some studies that are more pro-Dvorak showing that it doesn't put as much strain on your hands. And that has been verified. That's not kind of made up like the original statistics. But you can accomplish the same things by getting more ergonomic keyboards. While I was looking at this, I found some really weird designs for ergonomic keyboards. There are some that are kind of like your traditional keyboard. If you cut it in half in the middle and then offset it 30 degrees one way and then took the other half and offset it 30 degrees the other. Weird keyboard designs like these, they're much more ergonomic for your hands. They kind of hurt to look at, but they're better for you, and they actually provide more benefit than learning something like Dvorak would.
Right. Have you ever seen the ones where it's effectively a U shape where they've taken the keyboard, cut it in half, and then put it up so that your hands are vertical?
I haven't.
It's supposed to help with like wrist strain, but it seems incredibly difficult to type on because you have to change where your hands are just in space.
I feel like you'd probably be getting similar repetitive strain issues just in like a different spot.
Yeah, we just found new RSIs to add.
Yeah. So RSI is kind of a big topic when it comes to stuff like this, and there have actually been some recent developments. You kind of are seeing this return to trackball mice, and I tried to make that jump a few months ago. Definitely regret it. I can't get the hang of it. I don't really see the benefit, but the advantage there is you're only moving your thumb. You don't have to move your whole arm to move the mouse because you're just turning this trackball. And if you've never seen a mouse like that, it looks kind of like those old like bowling ball games in arcades where you like spin that ball. It's that same thing, just wedged on the side of a mouse. Obtuse, to say the least. But there have been a more recent development, and there's this thing called Tap or Tap Strap. It's this startup that I think you could sort of call it like a wireless keyboard in the sense that the keys are on your fingers. It's kind of like a brass knuckle that goes over your fingers.
How do you type with that?
Well, you only put one on one hand. As of right now, it doesn't look like they're working with two. And I know radio being strictly it's not a visual medium. It's a little difficult to get the idea across. But you have this thing on each of your fingers, and then you tap the fingers on a table in a certain order to input certain keys.
Oh.
And so this, they've been working on a prototype for a while, but they've recently started shipping them out. And the innovation isn't really in the device itself. Even optimally, you're going to be hitting maybe 30 words per minute. Of course, this is with one hand. Your other hand's free to do other stuff. Or you can just like tap on like a wall or something while you're waiting. There are certain advantages, but you're not really gaining that much speed.
You're also walking around wearing like a brass knuckle looking thing instead of having just a keyboard.
Exactly. It's intimidating to say the least. But the real innovation here, instead of, you know how like learning Dvorak versus QWERTY takes a long time?
Right.
They developed this app that they launched with their product, and it simplifies the learning process tremendously. It kind of gamifies it. It encourages and makes it more fun to be learning this weird new piece of technology. And that right there has helped a lot. People are able to learn how to type with the tap strap exponentially faster than switching from something like QWERTY to Dvorak, or even just learning to type for the first time. Of course, at the end of the day, it's not really much of an advantage when typing with your thumb on your phone is going to get you about the same speed using something like swipe.
Right. It does make sense that it's easier to learn though, because it's such a complete departure from the thing you're used to. It's like a whole separate skill instead of trying to have to break the old associations like you do when switching over from Dvorak.
Absolutely. And one big advantage I see potentially in the future, well, you can't really normally type like laying down or something like that. Or if you have a VR headset on, you can't see the keyboard, typing becomes more difficult. Something like this device would have potential use there. Or as things become more wireless and perhaps you're not bound to a monitor, you don't want to carry a keyboard with you, there's advantage there. But it looks like as of right now, it's just kind of the ground floor. I think we're going to see a departure from the keyboard a little bit, but it's kind of hard to beat what we've been using for over 100 years now, since like the typewriter.
Right. Ain't broke, don't fix it kind of thing.
Exactly. So another recent advantage of this isn't necessarily a keyboard or an input device for typing, but Microsoft has recently they launched something they call the Xbox Adaptive Controller, designed for people with disabilities. And so this product actually has, even though it's useless for the everyday consumer, for people with disabilities, this has been a breakthrough, not just in allowing them to play games in a more easy way, but also just navigating tools and software like in a job that they normally wouldn't be able to. As you might imagine, navigating a computer if you don't have hands is really, really hard. Right. So this device, it's kind of like this plain white slate it has your traditional game D-pad on it, and it has two big circle buttons, and 19 3.5 millimeter audio jacks out the back, 2 USB ports. You can plug a lot into it. And so this device acts as a hub for any sort of external thing you'd want, or that could help someone with disabilities navigate something. You can have very large buttons that you don't need like fine motor skills to press. You can add like foot pedals. People have been finding things that you can like use your tongue to like navigate as like a mouse cursor, something like that.
Right. And
so the advantage of this system, it came out, I think they were manufacturing them like late 2015, but this product, it uses the native drivers that every Windows computer already has for an Xbox controller. So immediately people can plug this device in and they can input and interact with a computer, which they couldn't really do before.
I've been watching people homebrew these sorts of controllers for a while, but I didn't realize that Microsoft was making them. The most specific one that I'd seen was either people would adapt them for one-handed, or they would literally split the controller in half if you couldn't bring your hands very close together.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see it from Microsoft's perspective.
They started seeing more people do stuff like this. They launched their Xbox Elite controller, and the whole advantage of that was all the parts were basically, they could be separated like you're talking about. And the target graphic was just your average person who wanted to play games. But they found people were doing exactly like what you said. They were cutting it in half, and they were using it for people with disabilities. So they decided to find a solution themselves.
Okay. When we come back, the interesting control schemes put in use by video games. Welcome back to Are We Doing This Right? Okay, so I mentioned kind of vaguely the weird control schemes. What I'm more specifically dealing with here is the specific buttons and keyboard presses and mouse movements that you use to control games.
All right.
They've kind of been standardized over the past every so often, especially for PC games with WSAD for movement. I think people use different use keys like F for Valve games, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily mean they have to be standardized like that. A lot of the things we're going to be talking about this segment it's not a bug, it's a feature-esque. So it's people taking advantage of making the control schemes kind of bad to enhance the overall game.
Oh, I think I know where this is going.
Yeah, I can't wait. And that is imposed either by the developer or, in a lot more fun ways, the user. The first one that I really want to talk about is this Flash game called QWOP. Now, pretty much anyone with an internet connection has played QWOP. If you're unfamiliar, it's a very simple Flash game where you're controlling an athlete named QWOP, and you control each of the muscles on his legs using the Q, W, O, and P keys on your keyboard. If you look down at a keyboard, those are just on the top row on either side. Q and W controls the thighs, O and P controls the calves, and you have to move like that. It's very, very difficult.
Yeah, it's exactly as difficult as it sounds.
Right, and this was released in 2008. It was a very prototypical Flash game. It's very simple, it's lo-fi, and it's endlessly frustrating.
Yeah.
I think there's an endpoint. There might be 100 meters, but I've certainly never reached it.
Yeah, you get a little certificate if you hit 100 meters.
Which I don't know how much you'd have to hate yourself to try that, but sure. And it was such a huge thing in its simplicity. That's the only thing that made it worth playing. Just the difficulty imposed by having this awful control scheme. It was such an impactful thing that at one point it was even featured in the MoMA in New York City. I didn't know that till last night, but there was a video game magazine that did an exhibition, and so QWOP was briefly in an art museum.
I mean, it's like looking at if you just forgot how to walk. It's like that kind of thing. It makes you think.
Exactly. And it's one of those things that could only exist from indie developers because it's just so out there and weird and such little possibility of turning a profit. And it's something that only an indie developer would try. This one specifically was named Bennett Foddy. Yeah. the real difficulty is just because it takes away the abstraction that we're used to in games. Normally, we're used to just kind of as a standard, W means forward, S means back. And taking that away kind of, pulls things back, and you realize exactly how hard games could be, and they're not.
Yeah, there's a reason you're not controlling every little input on a game.
Yeah, it just shines an interesting light on how we play games in general. The other thing with how we play games in general is this awful community that we've talked about before, speedrunners.
Oh, yeah.
This harkens all the way back to our first episode back in October, but the speedrunning community has this fun little subset called alternate controls. Speedrunners, part of the prestige is making games harder.
Of
and
course.
Still having that very, very, very fast time. They're inherently obsessed with these kinds of limits and categorizations, so the harder the run is, the more it's worth in terms of like social, this is popularity points, basically. And so in that vein, they take alternate control runs, the most prolific of which is DDR speedruns. So these people will take either the arcade machine or even one of the like foam pads that they use for the Wii versions of Dance Dance Revolution. I'm sure everyone's familiar with this game, but if you're not, it's played by stomping on pads on the ground.
It's designed explicitly for dancing games and only dancing games.
Right, and so when you take this thing designed for rhythm games and nothing else and apply it to other things, it gets bad. The most common one that I've seen with these is Dark Souls, which is a game it's an action RPG. It's known for its kind of difficulty and like just killing players by the amount of time it takes to play it and the amount of like impossibility with the controls. I've never played it. I think you have, Ezra.
I've seen my roommate play it. It's basically designed to be near impossible, and through trial and error, it becomes possible. Of course, it has a traditional control scheme in mind.
Right, and you said control scheme, you're right. These pads have to be remapped to specific inputs. So like the left forward button is now W, the right forward button is now just shoot. It's things like that with usually these even have to be using 2-player pads because you just normally only have 4 to 8 buttons on a DDR pad. So you have to play with 2 at once basically if you want to get anything done. Even things like there was one speedrunner who played through all the bosses of Cuphead using one, and the machine was so limited, he even had the full arcade machine, that he had to assign weapon switch to like one of the door switches on the arcade machine. So he'd have to like go up, unlock a door, open it, and close it to switch weapons in Cuphead.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so it adds this entirely new, just extra dimension of, this is incredibly impossible to these games that makes the times much more impressive. And these speedrunners are still setting amazing times with these things of full completion speedruns. I've even seen one where he interpreted it and hooked up to a Nintendo 64 and played Super Mario 64 with it. And watching the terrible things he had to do to like, even walking forward, he had to just tap that forward button multiple times. He couldn't hold it. And he still finished the entire game in like 36 minutes with full completion. No like using glitches to get through things.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So you add this like physical aspect to every game. By changing these control structures, you change the very nature of the game because the skills are different. Instead of having those precision skills and mainly just your hands, you now have to throw your entire body around just to play the game. So it's again, one of these things that adds so much new interest and this extra dimension to these speedruns that it changes everything for the player. The real other prolific one, I want to cover one main speedrunner. His name is Ben Gwynn, aka Bearsley. Have you ever heard of this guy before?
The name rings a bell.
Right. This guy holds the world record for most alternate control speedruns of Dark Souls. He has done it with a DDR pad. My favorite, though, and the one he's done the most of, are like Guitar Hero and Rock Band controllers.
Like Rock Band, like the thing with like the drums and stuff?
With the Guitar Hero controller, it was crazy what he had to do to remap it. This guy's a software developer, so he can basically bodge any controller into any game that he wants. And moving forward involved pushing down on the whammy bar, the bar on the front of the guitar, and then in Rock Band, you can kind of like shake the guitar upwards to start power-ups. He'd basically just have to like shake the guitar every time he wanted to do an attack. And he would stream the entire thing on Twitch. It's so much fun to watch. And he's still laying down incredibly impressive times. He's also done one with the drum controller.
Ooh.
Where in order to move forward, it's a lot like that DDR pad. He had to basically be doing a roll on one of the snare controllers the entire time. So just hitting it constantly in order to move forward. One hit was like holding down like the W on the keyboard for like half a second. So he just had to be constantly hitting it in order to get anywhere. And that's the other thing that's incredibly impressive to watch. My favorite of his, though, are he repurposed these controllers from the Donkey Kong GameCube game, where there was this version of the controller where it was a pair of bongos. And the bongos have built into the top basically 2 buttons. And so he now had 4 buttons and had to find some other way to switch between different layouts. But guess what? He beat Dark Souls with a bongo controller.
That's incredible. I know regarding obtuse speedruns, I don't know if they ever completed the game, but I saw someone once use potato batteries, like the small electric charge held by potatoes, to function as a controller for, I believe, Doom. Just moving left and right by like plugging and unplugging wires into different potatoes.
Right. It's a lot of things like that. It's so incredible to see what this kind of community will go to in order to try new things after a game has just been run just on its own, that finding those interesting ways to increase the difficulty, it's incredible.
Absolutely.
All right. When we come back on Are We Doing This Right? Everyone's least favorite video game, Desert Bus.
Welcome back to Are We Doing This Right? So we're going to be talking about, you stole my line. I was going to segue in with Pepsi Man, but harking back to our first episode, this game, Desert Bus, has a strange community around it. So a little bit of history. In 1955, Penn and Teller, the magician duo, they designed this game for the Sega Genesis, and it was never released. The publisher went out of business after reviews and review copies had been sent out. Reviewers had reviewed the game, but before the game had hit shelves. So no one had copies of it. But as described, it featured 5 minigames. They were kind of designed, for the most part, to sort of like trick your friends. An example would be like a quiz for the player, and it would ask them strange questions like how they prefer to wear sunglasses. And from these ridiculous questions, it would guess their birthday, and it would get it right every single time.
So is this supposed to be passed off as like a normal game? This wasn't supposed to be like, was it kind of like a prank that you would pull on your friends?
Exactly. The way the birthday thing would work is the owner of the game would enter the person who is coming over to try the game. It would enter their birthday in a secret menu, a hidden interface, before the player opens it. One of the other ones they had, I thought this was kind of cool. So the game plays kind of like a clone of that old arcade game Galaga with 2 players. However, the person with the player 1 controller, they have like cheats built into all of the buttons. So the only button you need is like fire and move, but the other buttons do different things to stop the player from dying or to intentionally like cause more enemies to target the opponent. And the catch is one of the buttons swaps the cheats to player 2. So if they don't believe you and they think you're cheating and they ask to swap controllers, you press the button before you swap it, and then you can still cheat on the other one.
And you're telling me this wasn't a financial success?
Honestly, it's a shame it never hit the market. They had this action RPG where you play as Penn and Teller, attempting to expose other magicians as frauds by like summoning stunt doubles to like beat them up. Very strange, very surreal. But the most famous was Desert Bus. And Desert Bus features in crisp 16-bit 1995 graphics a real-time trip from Tucson, Arizona to Las Vegas in a bus that has a maximum speed of 45 miles per hour.
That's, oh my God, that's like 4 or 5 hours?
8 hours.
Oh, jeez.
It is an 8-hour drive. The only scenery to the player is the occasional tree and cactus as they travel through the Arizona desert. And the bus has a tendency to veer to the right. So if the player puts the controller down for a few seconds, the bus will accidentally veer off the road. So the player has to constantly be focusing on this trip through the desert in real time.
And let me guess, it never tells you that it's 8 hours at the outset?
Oh, no, it does. It lets you know from the very beginning. And so if the player successfully reaches Las Vegas, they are greeted with a simple screen that's like, congratulations, and then your score goes up by 1. And it's like, would you like to take the return trip from Las Vegas back to Tucson, Arizona for an additional point? Yes or no? And so then the player can attempt to take the reverse trip 8 hours back. The highlight of the game is right at about the 5-hour mark of straight driving. A bug will splat on the windshield. And that's the only change.
Jeez. And you're this isn't just a straight road. Like, you're not just correcting for the veer, or is it like...
No, it's a straight road.
So you just have to correct for it, just lean a little right every so often.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh.
If you do steer off the road, the bus will get towed back to Tucson, Arizona in real time. So if you're 4 hours in, you get towed 4 hours back. And the reason why this exists, why Penn and Teller thought this would be a good idea, is at this time, the U.S. Attorney General went on saying that all video games were murder simulators. And this really upset Penn and Teller, and so they wanted to prove her wrong. And they, I guess, succeeded. They originally wanted to have a contest bundled with the game. Whoever in America could get the highest score in Desert Bus would get to travel in real life in a bus from Tucson, Arizona to Las Vegas, except this time the bus would be like a party bus full of like a live band and super lively, and they'd get to see all these cool shows in Las Vegas. They already had everything printed for this competition. They were ready to go, but the game never hit shelves. So the reason why we know all this about these strange games, and most importantly Desert Bus, is because in 2005, some of the people who had review copies uploaded them online, and people were able to play this, I guess, classic in an emulator.
I guess classic. Absolutely classic.
Absolutely. So there were a few people out there, once like kind of the buzz went out about what this was, there were a couple people, uploaded their Desert Bus playthroughs on YouTube. But in 2007, this charity organization called Desert Bus for Hope got started. So Desert Bus for Hope raises money for Child's Play, and Child's Play is a charity organization that raises money to give games and consoles to kids who are hospitalized and they can't go outside or maybe even socialize with other kids. It helps make their time in the hospital feel that much more normal and that much more like any other kids, and it's awesome. But Desert Bus for Hope got started with 4 people, and during their trip to Las Vegas from Arizona, Penn and Teller actually called in, and they sent donations in themselves.
What platform is this hosted on? Is that like Twitch? Or
actually not sure. I don't know if Twitch was around back then. I know now they host it on Twitch, which brings me to the next point. So the first Desert Bus for Hope, they raised $20,000, which was incredible given that they are streaming a game that is driving in a straight line for 8 hours. They played it for a couple of days. It's not as well documented on the first one, but they did it again. They hosted Desert Bus for Hope 2, Bus Harder, and they played it for 5 days straight, and they raised $70,000. And that brings us to Desert Bus for Hope 3. It's Desert Bus 6 in Japan. That is the title.
For all of our audio listeners, I just want to make note of how much Ezra is struggling to say these names sitting across from me.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So the third Desert Bus for Hope raised $140,000. The fourth one, Desert Bus for Hope 4, A New Hope, it actually, Penn and Teller called back in, and they auctioned off their own bus ticket from Tucson, Arizona to Las Vegas. And of course, the ticket was expired, not usable, but it had their signatures on it, and they included some authentic sand from the Las Vegas desert. And this time they raised $200,000. Then we had Desert Bus for Hope 5. Der Five-Ert Bus, the 5 being the S.
Oh, gee.
And they raised 400,000. Desert Bus for Hope 007 raised almost 500,000. Desert Bus for Hope 9, the Joy of Busing, raised $700,000. And so they've been continuing this event every single year since then, the most recent being Desert Bus for Hope 2018. I think they do it late winter, and they've raised $5 million for Child's Play playing Desert Bus.
Are these people affiliated in any way with the like Awesome Games Done Quick people?
They aren't actually. I thought they would be because it's kind of a similar overlap of people playing games to like and live streaming them to raise money for charity. I think the charities they're donating to are sometimes the same, but otherwise they're completely unaffiliated.
Wow. I would have expected.
The press revolving around all these people playing this very, very boring game has actually caused Desert Bus to get, I'm kind of reluctant to call it a comeback, but I guess that's what it is. So with the birth of mobile games, there actually was a complete remake of Desert Bus available, and when people bought it, it would donate the money to charity, of course, in honor of, or in the same vein as Desert Bus for Hope. And most recently, in 2013, they actually created an Atari 2600 port of Desert Bus to drop the graphic level that much further.
Oh, God.
And very recently, I think late 2017, the company behind the Borderlands series, Gearbox, they acquired the rights to Desert Bus, and they released for free Desert Bus VR. It's multiplayer, and by that I mean one person drives the bus, and then other people can annoy the bus driver and just throw stuff at him. But other than that, it's effectively unchanged from the original. Modernized visuals, and Penn of Penn and Teller actually came back, and he recorded all these audio like tapes and stuff for it that are intentionally designed to be informative but as boring as possible. In the VR trip through the Arizona desert, there is a audio tape of someone coloring on a coloring page, and it's just the sounds of someone coloring.
Right.
It's interesting to see that this very strange thing got adapted. The most, maybe the only important feature of Desert Bus VR is on the bus. There's this big old bumper sticker that says Desert Bus for Hope, trying to raise publicity and awareness for the charity.
Right.
So this very, very strange game has kind of, a fan base, and some good has come out of the most obtuse input system in any game ever created.
Again, it's one of those things like the speedruns where it's not necessarily about the content itself. It's about what we have done to make it awful. All right, when we come back, teletext and all that it used to be. Welcome back to Are We Doing This Right? Okay, so teletext, right? That's probably a word you've never even heard before.
I do not know what that is.
Teletext is this artifact of analog TV where using specific technologies that we'll get into in a minute, they would transmit full pages of text and very lo-fi graphics over just television signals that normally you wouldn't even be able to see. They're decoded by a box in your TV. This was kind of started in the 80s and even in some places lasted through the end of the early 2010s rather. And it was something that was just so weird and out there that it doesn't even make sense that it existed that long in the first place.
What conventional uses were there for this?
So this was mainly used as a news magazine service. So you'd be able to pull or start up the decoder on your TV, and it would display these pages of news and stocks and things like that. So it was a way of transmitting that stuff either during the off hours where TV transmitters wouldn't be broadcasting or some wouldn't be broadcasting, or just kind of auxiliary content to whatever was on the TV. There were some interactive uses for it, but they weren't that common. The much more common were that kind of news magazine services. So before we get into the failures and the successes of this, I want to talk a little bit about how it works. So like I said, this thing is entirely rooted in analog TV, okay? So you're transmitting a picture a line at a time. At the bottom of every frame or field, as they're called in analog TV, there's this big block of blank that tells the TV that it needs to start a new frame. This is called the vertical sync pulse. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Is it making sense so far?
Yeah.
Okay, so people realized as early as the 1960s that you could start hiding information in that vertical sync pulse and without affecting the rest of the TV picture. This is actually how closed captioning works. So they will encode the data into that pulse and just stick it there, and a decoder in your TV will decode that into the caption system. So once we realized that we could kind of place things in that pulse and decode them separately from the actual TV signal, it opened up a lot of possibilities. Like I said, closed captions was the first one. That was really what they intended this for originally. This was mainly a development of the BBC. They were trying to make things accessible for deaf people watching television. And this started as early as the 1960s, but wasn't really implemented until the late 70s, which seems a lot later than I would have expected for closed captioning to be available on television.
I'd never really even thought about how closed captioning works.
Right. It seems like such an integral thing that you wouldn't even think about it not being there, but just the fact that they kind of had to hack it in after TV had already been a thing for quite a long time.
Yeah, it doesn't seem high-tech at all compared to how other things work. But, like, I never thought about how interesting it is that it even works on old TVs.
Right. And that sync pulse and a lot of things with analog TV are kind of artifacts of everything has to be backwards compatible to black and white TVs from the 1960s, to the point of things like hiding things in the sync pulse. You probably don't know what macrovision is. It was like DRM, but for VCRs.
Interesting.
And they would basically hide stuff in the sync pulse to mess with VCRs that were trying to dub pirated tapes, things like that. But the British realized after a while that you could use this sync pulse for more than just the closed captioning. You could actually display entire pages of text with it. There was enough like data there. So what they did was start this program called teletext. There were a few competing standards across Europe, but the British one eventually won out and was adopted and adapted for the rest of Europe. This is much more common over there. When we tried to bring it over to the US, it kind of failed. I want to talk about that. There was this American company called Keycom in the early 1980s that saw teletext and saw an opportunity to bring it to the United States, both as for like news, but also advertising and being able to show it. Keycom was a news magazine like the type we talked about earlier. So it would be 100 pages of text that you could flip through with this individual remote and decoder on your TV. It was interactive.
What year was this?
This was the earliest they started bringing it over was 1980, and they started transmitting in 1982.
So definitely preceding the internet in the average person's home.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But this is also starting in with the home computer boom. The original non-interactive version was started on just one station in Chicago, but it actually ended up getting piggybacked onto TBS when the superstations started coming out, those cable networks. The real problem with it was cost. Okay, so for renting the decoder box, which was necessary, and for the monthly service, it was a combined $20 in 1984 when it actually started airing, which is about $50 in 2019 money per month.
And
for
that's
the service.
Just for decoding. That's like on top of the existing cable costs?
Right. Well, this even wasn't necessarily on cable. This could be on cable, but yes, that would be in addition to whatever your TV subscription was. The real problem, it also comes from those decoders. They actually started transmitting this stuff in the United States in 1982, but none of the decoders were underwriters listed. Do you know what underwriters is?
I do not.
They're a lab that does consumer safety. If you've ever seen like on an extension cord, that little UL in a circle, that means that logo means it's certified safe for consumers to use. They have to certify like consumer products, electronic devices, that kind of thing.
Of course.
So anything you use in your home that's electric, they have to say, yeah, this is fine. This is safe. They didn't actually get certified until 1984, which was already a big problem for them. The other thing was that in order to be profitable over the entire national network that TBS gave them access to, they would need about 200,000 subscribers. They only ever reached about 15% of that with the original non-interactive $50 equivalent a month system.
That's got to take quite a hit.
Yeah, and so this system, after a couple years of working on it, was taken off the air. It was a failure. What they came back almost immediately after was this new product called Keycom Interactive that worked along very similar lines. Now, again, like I said, home computer boom. This was a new interactive program that would use teletext and would allow you to do things like shop and stuff. It was proto-internet, basically. There were a few problems, though. Again, a big one was cost. It was a $60 piece of software, which is about $150 today, along with either a $15 a month, which is about $36 today, for 5 hours use, or $30 a month, aka $75 a day for 15 hours use. And this is a lot. It's kind of like a data plan on a cell phone. You can think of it a lot like that. But the real problem was it was only launched in Chicago. It wasn't piggybacked on that national network like before. So they started with a base of 200 subscribers, and while it worked, it worked pretty well. It was hard to get people on board with saying, yeah, I want to pay this upfront money to do what this might be able to do, right? At their peak in Chicago, they only ended up having about 300 subscribers, and that entire portion of the company had to fold afterwards.
It's interesting thinking that this technology was created, implemented, and worked, and only 300 people were really using it.
Well, it worked, yes, but it wasn't necessarily the utility that everyone wanted. Like, I say shopping, but there's no telling how good that shopping actually was. Was it actually worth as much money as it cost? If you had to pay $150 and then $20 a month or actually $75 a month to use like Amazon,
of course,
that would be unrealistic. Yeah. Even though that's by kind of modern price standards. Even like Prime isn't going to cost that much. So it's hard to justify that when the technology is new. It runs into that problem of early adopters, right?
No one really wants to pay money to access your service with which they spend more money.
Absolutely. And it's hard to get people on board when it costs so much upfront if they aren't already just excited about the technology in its own right.
People were already skeptical enough about the internet, and that's much less obtuse than this was.
Right. The more working system was actually in the UK. There was one in LA, I think, called Electra that was, again, non-interactive and that worked pretty well, but it is nothing compared to the BBC's own system. The BBC's own system is called CFAX, C-E-E. All these have fax in their name because they're originally derived from fax machines when they were first building them back in the 60s. CFAX was, again, non-interactive, and one of the key points that helped it succeed was that it was not an extra cost to the consumer. You pay for the BBC kind of like with a subscription service over there, and that was just included with it. It was having the decoders built into every TV that didn't cost much extra. It wasn't nearly as big of a deal, right? This was the original outshoot of that effort to create television more accessible for the deaf, right?
Yeah.
This was their original iteration on that system. And this is by far the longest lasting one too. Throughout it, it had that kind of like 1980s graphic aesthetic. This is very, very low res, lo-fi. It's all ASCII characters and colored blocks. If you've ever seen a screenshot of like a BBS system, that's what the entire thing looks like.
Intimidating.
Yeah, very intimidating. But it worked well enough. It was actually said that at the time, it was one of the fastest ways to get breaking news sometimes because it was very, very quick to edit these CFAX pages.
You wouldn't have to get someone in front of a screen. You could just kind of hit send.
Exactly. It was also a very fast way for people who wanted like live stock prices. That was one of the incredibly fast ways to get them, which just like it does today, mattered a lot back then. If you don't work inside an office that has some sort of live feed, that was the fastest way to get them. And again, this was a free service. This was the primary thing that let it survive.
I imagine people would be at least interested in trying it if it was free.
Right. And these decoders were built into almost every TV sold in the British market through the late 2000s. The entire thing was that, or the other really interesting thing that did with it was BBC had a microcomputer in the 80s called the BBC Micro. This is kind of a competitor to the Commodore 64. If you've ever seen it, they look very, very similar. They do similar things.
Yeah.
It was meant mainly for education or to be like your first computer, or really. So what they did was using teletext, they would transmit software in this program called telesoftware for like 7 years during the 80s. So you could receive free software for your computer through this like package that comes free with your TV.
I think in Japan, they implemented something similar with the Famicom.
Really?
Yeah. Same kind of pre-internet streaming service, but it hooked into the Famicom instead of, I don't know, I imagine the underlying technology was probably pretty similar.
Right. That's really interesting. I didn't know about that, but it's like, it's interesting the way that they kind of repurpose these sorts of services to do these things. So if this was so successful and widely used, where'd it go? Like we've been talking about, this entire thing was an artifact of analog television. And in the late aughts and the early 2010s, you're getting to the point where people are switching over from analog to digital TV. And digital TV doesn't have those sync pulses. The last CFAX broadcast was in 2012 when Northern Ireland shut off its last high-power analog transmitter. And basically after that, it was no more. It's been replaced by this other sort of information system that the BBC has called BBC Red Dot, but, you know, it's not the same.
Does BBC Red Dot run off of like cellular network or?
No, it's still bundled under your cable, but it looks kind of like a menu from a cable box. It's just, it's the same kind of deal, but it is still just something that's completely integral with your cable or your satellite service.
And a lot more modern.
Right. And, you know, I hate to say it, but I do miss those little graphics, seeing those. It's kind of a shame.
It's nostalgic.
In a weird way. All right, that's our show this week. Thank you for listening to Are We Doing This Right? We do this show every week, Fridays at 2.
Not next week, though. Spring break.
Yeah, spring break. We'll actually have something interesting for you at the end of spring break, so continue listening for that. Follow us on Twitter at AWDTR Pod. That's AWDTR as in Are We Doing This Right? You can listen every week at WEGLFM.com or at 91.1 WEGL in Auburn. I'm Grayson.
I'm Ezra.
Thank you for listening.